Hi ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joel Hunter here to discuss with you the second video that we're going to cover human research. And in this video, I'm going to step through the 4 primary source readings that I've assigned to accompany the instructional text on human research. And I want to give you just a very, very brief overview of them, as well as show you what essay questions I expect you to be able to answer on the next quiz. So hopefully this will be very practical for you, and hopefully not too complicated, not too difficult. The readings are fairly accessible. They are in your Vaughan text in the readings section, and for chapter 6 those begin on page 259, and that's where you will need to go for your first one, which is going to be on the Nuremburg Code. So let me jump over now to the presentation and let's step through the slide deck for these readings. Okay, so we are in the primary reading section. Again, that's page 259 where it starts. So let's look at the Nuremburg Code. This was a code developed as a result of the findings and discussion around the Nuremberg trial of 1945-1947, and I believe the code was published in 1949. And this was a result of what came out of some of the horrors of the practices of Nazi doctors and scientists in Germany during World War II, particularly on their concentration camp prisoners, of the kinds of experiments that they would run on human beings that had little, if any, scientific merit, at least in any kind of broad consensus of scientific merit, and were conducted certainly without the consent of the humans who were subjected to many times horrific experiments. So out of this came then an expression of what rules then should govern us going forward when it comes to research on human beings. And it's acknowledged that to continue to improve treatments and therapies for human health, there's going to always be a need for human research, but the protection of the human subject is going to be paramount now. And so we have then this list of 10 standards given in the code, and it's, I think, worthwhile pointing out the number 1 code is the number 1 item, the number 1 standard is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The language doesn't get any stronger than that. That is a non-negotiable, non-conditional requirement. Voluntary consent from the human subject to participate in the study or in the trial. And so notice that then is going to limit your population on whom you have the permission to conduct experiments. Okay, so that's going to come up in the next reading, but that's important to see what the beginning context is. So your essay question is this: what does the code say about the degree of risk that subjects may undertake? And then you are to explain the reasoning for this standard. Okay, so I'll point you directly to the paragraph in the code that talks about the degree of risk, and that's paragraph 6. We'll just read it together here. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. So there it is. That's what the code says. So there's part of your answer. But then the second part of your answer is going to be, okay, now explain the reasoning behind that standard. Okay, so you're weighing then, on the one hand, the subject's willingness to undergo the risk. So they have to be knowledgeable of those risks. But then what are the other considerations here? And that's expressed in the code by the terms, the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experimenter. So what kind of reasoning is involved there? This would be a great time to think about when you're talking about explanations like this, is to think about the ethical theories that you can use as a basis for that explanation. For example, what would a consequentialist or utilitarian say is the reasoning for the standard? What would a Kantian deontological theory say is the reasoning for the standard? What would a social contract theorist say is the reasoning for the standard? And so on. So think about, and this is what I need you to do then. I need you to be explicit in what theoretical approach you would take to give the reasoning for the standard. You can also, if you wish, put in your answer what reasoning, what theoretical perspective you think the authors of the code were taking. You know, what theoretical perspective of ones that we've looked at do you think are implicit in the reasoning for this standard about the degree of risk that subjects can undertake? Okay, so what you're doing then is you're not only saying, well, here's what the standard says, or here's what the code says, but then you're saying, well, explain now the reasoning behind that. Okay? So that's what you got to do, is all of one answer. Okay, next one is the Code of Helsinki, and this was building on the Nuremberg Code. This was adopted in 1964 initially. It went through 7 revisions, and the most recent, I believe, was 2013. And that's what's represented here in your or reprinted in your text. And it breaks some new ground. And one of the most interesting changes from Nuremberg to the Helsinki Code is that, if you remember, the Nuremberg Code sets out in the very first principle that the informed consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Well, here in the Helsinki, Declaration of Helsinki, this code relaxes that. And there's a very good reason for that. And one is that sometimes experimentation has to occur on individuals who cannot, of their own accord, cannot give their informed consent. And you can think of examples of that, and it's discussed in the code itself. So there are exceptions then, and those are covered mainly in paragraphs 22 through 26 of that code. Let me just find that page number for you. So the declaration is given on pages 260 through 263. And the focus there for the relaxing of the informed consent standard from Nuremberg is paragraphs 22 through 26, where some other populations are expected and necessary to advance medical research. And so have to navigate then this ethical problem of, well, what does informed consent look like? And oftentimes that looks like the obtaining consent for someone who is responsible for, say, a minor, or someone who is physically or mentally unable to give their consent, maybe legally even incompetent. Okay, then some other interesting things in the Declaration of Helsinki, and these have to do with revisions that were made on the Declaration over time, have to do with incorporating some concerns of social justice, and those are, I've listed those there, some of the paragraphs where that's brought out explicitly. Your essay question for this reading then is this: what does the ethical code say about conducting research on subjects who are not able to give informed consent? So that's the first half, and then the second half, what balance does the code strike between the interests of science or society on the one hand, and those of the human subjects on the other? And by the way, those of the human subjects, especially those who are not able to give informed consent. Okay, so your code, what does it say about conducting research on subjects who are not able to give informed consent? I've already indicated in the previous slide here that the paragraphs that you'll want to focus on will be mainly 22 through 26. Now I want to point out, though, a couple other paragraphs that are relevant here. Paragraph 5 tells you explicitly what the balance is between the interests of science or society and those of human subjects. It's very clear in paragraph 5 that the well-being of the human subject should take precedence over the interests of science and society. Okay, so that's the balance. Now, what you need to do, though, is integrate that with, well, what does the welfare or the well-being of the human subject who is unable to give their informed consent, what does that look like? So obviously one would be, well, their health and life, right? Or maybe their rights. So rights might be an important topic to discuss here. So I would point you then to paragraph 8 of the Declaration, where it's stated that medical research is subject to ethical standards that promote respect for all human beings and protect their health and rights. Now notice there, all human beings are entitled to this respect. And so what does that mean? And that is elaborated in the rest of paragraph 8. So have a look at that closely. That will help you, I believe, answer this question. Then, as far as what are the interests of science or society, those are covered in other paragraphs in the code. And so that would be things like paragraph 19, for example. Paragraphs, what else? 22, for example. So, where did I want to say? I wanted to point you to something else. The additional principles also will be worth looking at. Another paragraph I want to point your attention to is the paragraph 18, I think it is. Let's see. Yes, medical research involving human subjects should only be conducted if the importance of the objective outweighs the inherent risks and burdens to the subject. This is especially important when the human subjects are healthy volunteers. So in other words, if you take a healthy volunteer and you conduct human research on them, then there could be a risk of making their health worse. Well, that's violating a basic principle, medical principle, which is discussed in the very first paragraphs of the code. Okay, so now obviously a healthy volunteer is someone who can give their informed consent, so that doesn't apply to the first half of the question. But the second half is the benefits to a population, let's say, make it generic, have to the importance of those objectives for the research have to outweigh the risks and burdens to the subject. Okay, so that's true for all human subjects. All right, and what else? So there is an emphasis then on the benefits not only to the subjects themselves of the research, but also the larger benefits to the population who suffers from whatever the condition is that's being studied, or the wider benefits to society, maybe public health. Okay. Next is the final report on human radiation experiments that were conducted from 1944 to 1974. There were human subjects who were exposed to harmful levels of radiation and were often without their consent, not being told of the potential dangers, certainly. And there was a committee formed 20 years later to study the effects of this. Some of this had to do with uranium mining. Some of this had to do with research that was conducted on military bases. And there are privacy concerns, national security concerns involved there, and so you have that conflict between certain public goods of national security on the one hand, but then the public goods of the welfare of our citizens. So This report then was issued in 1995. And what I want you to do, and there's this sort of preamble. They talk about why the committee was formed, what the president asked them to do, the committee's approach, the context for the research itself. And then the committee gets into its key findings and its recommendations. And that's the part that you need to focus on. And so the question that I have for you is taken really from those two parts. So the first half of the question will come from the key findings. What deficiencies did the committee uncover in contemporary human research involving radiation? Okay, so you should be able to describe those deficiencies. And then the second part will come from the recommendations. Do you think the policies recommended in the report are adequate to protect the rights and interests of individuals and the public? So you have to know what those recommendations were, what policy recommendations were made by the committee. And then you have to then say something about whether you think those are adequate to protect public health and the rights and interests of individuals. Okay, and then give a justification for your answer of why you think they are adequate or why you don't think they're adequate. Okay, so that's what's required in that question. Okay, and the last reading, and those three are fairly short, and the fourth one, it's not long, and it is fairly straightforward. So let me just hit some of the highlights of this and then get you to the essay question. So this is an article written by Marcia Angell, and it is arguing that randomized clinical trials are morally permissible only when treatment is in a state of equipoise. Now that term equipoise is a technical term, and it's discussed in the instructional part of your text. It's referenced there, so do have a look if you need to refresh your memory about that term. It was in our vocabulary in the last video too, although I didn't really expound on it at length. But do have a look in your instructional text if you need to refresh your memory of that. I believe it's also in the glossary of your text, so you can look there as well. Okay, so there's this condition then for randomized clinical trials to be morally permissible, according to Angell, and that is for them to be, the treatment has to be in a state of equipoise. Well, what does that mean in this case? Well, it means that there's the researcher has no good reason to think that one treatment is going to be better than another, or is better than another. So, what current therapies are available to treat whatever the condition is that's being studied? Well, maybe there aren't any. If that's the case, then it would seem that a treatment with placebo would be ethical. But what if there is an existing type of treatment? Is there a reason for the investigator, good reason to think that the existing treatment is better than another, or that the new treatment is better than the existing treatment? Okay, so that's the standard there. Equipoise would be that there is really no good reason to prefer one treatment over another. Okay, so some studies then will turn out to be unethical that use placebo-treated control groups. And so those would be those where the state of equipoise is not present, that there is a good reason to prefer or think that one treatment is more effective than another. Okay? So those types of studies, of trials, should not use placebos, according to Angell. So the case that she discusses that highlights this issue is the trials that test treatments that prevent HIV transmission or infection from a mother to her infant. Okay, and this in particular was the ones that she's highlighting and discussing are studies that were conducted in third world populations. Now, right there, you have the alarm bell going off. Vulnerable population. You have then a group that is perhaps not not able to engage with the level of treatment, the level of care, and understand the level of care that is available to them in developed countries. And so there is that risk, the additional risk of exploiting a third world or vulnerable population. Okay, and so what Angell thinks that occurred. And she makes a comparison then to the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis, which we discussed that in your text. You might want to review that, although she does discuss it as well. Okay, so what she finds in how researchers justified their use of a placebo-treated control group in their third world trial for this HIV treatment was that there was no local standard of care, or that the local standard of care to prevent HIV transmission from mother to infant there was no treatment. And so that was the local standard of care. So that is in effect the same thing as having a placebo-treated control group. Therefore, that's what they did. But Angell argues that that is unethical because this idea of the local standard of care, well, that isn't what the ethical standards say. It has to do with, well, what is the best available standard of care, not what the local standard of care is. It isn't that specific. And so if there was a treatment, an effective treatment that was available, then that's what they should have used, or they should have made that available to the subjects, which they did not do. Well, all but one study did not do that. Okay, so your essay question then is you need to understand what the local standard of care means, and then what does she say? What does Angell say about that claim that giving no treatment in a third world clinical trial is the local standard of care? So, what is her, what criticism does she make of that claim? And regardless of whether or not that's accurate or not, is it ethical, right? Okay, so those are your readings for this week and your essay questions that are going to be on the next quiz. And good luck with that. If you have any questions, of course, shoot me an email, and I will see you next time.